Welcome to the Colby Cast, episode 15. Thanks for joining us. In this episode, Hope and Bonnie are joined by Colby teacher and homeschooling veteran, Mrs. Therese Prudlo. Mrs. Prudlo teaches history, a subject she uses as a lens for engaging all the subjects. The lens of history is a force that diminishes ignorance and necessarily causes hope. It is ultimately an affirmation of revelation and an opening of one's eyes to the truth. Stay tuned for practical tips on how to engage history like a historian. Enjoy the show.
Hi there, I'm Bonnie, Colby homeschooling mom, liturgical musician, podcast fanatic, heavy library user, and Colby parent ambassador. I have 2 lads and 2 lasses. The youngest is in 5th grade, the eldest is in 10th, and this is our 4th year homeschooling with Colby.
And I'm Hope, Bonnie's younger sister and a Colby alumna in a phase of life after being a student, but before becoming a parent. I studied communication theory and philosophy in college, then I went to law school. Now I'm an attorney, an avid home cook, and the fun aunt to Bonnie's kids.
We're joined by Therese Prudlo, who's one of the Colby Online instructors and a homeschooling parent. Welcome, Therese. Thanks so much for coming on the Colby Cast.
Thank you for having me, Bonnie. This is so exciting.
It's a real pleasure to speak to you today on one of your fields of expertise. We are taking a deep dive into the Colby history curriculum today. Therese is ideally suited to tell us about this because she takes an approach to life through the lens of history. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Oh, thank you, Bonnie. I'm in my 5th year teaching here at Colby Academy. I teach in the history department, 8th grade, 9th grade, and 11th grade history, as well as I do the high school textbook classes from the Catholic Textbook Project. I'm a parent of three children. I have a daughter who graduated from Colby last year. She's a sophomore now in college, and my youngest is a current student at Colby Academy, and then I have a middle kiddo who he's our forever kid. He has autism, and he goes to a special school near where we live. Even before I taught at Colby, we've been a Colby family. I introduced Colby early on in my sort of parenting homeschool career. My kids started with doing homeschool classes, and it just sort of naturally led itself into doing online classes. And I was incredibly fortunate to join the Colby faculty as a history teacher, and I have been loving it ever since.
Your background is so neat, and hearing how you have just the logical progression of you starting out homeschooling with your family and then stepping into a role at Colby. I sometimes marvel when I'm reading through the faculty bios, how many of them are homeschooling parents, and then they offer their areas of expertise and service to the Colby online school or other areas in Colby that they can contribute that way. So I think that is really, really neat.
It's a wonderful family atmosphere, I think, for parents and teachers and students alike. That's one of the things we really have always enjoyed about Colby.
We have been looking at different areas of the Colby curriculum, doing some deep dives, or will be. This is one of the first that we're doing. Therese, why don't you take us away on this Colby's take on history?
History, I mean, I have always had a great love of history. Even when I was a kid, I just loved picking up historical books, even historical literature, novels, and all sorts of things. But I really found my love for history when I went off to college. So I went to a Catholic college in the East, Christendom College. Some of your listeners may be familiar with that. And I was fortunate enough to have Dr. Warren Carroll, who had founded the college, as my history professor there. And he just instilled a great love of history in each and every one of us that took his class. I mean, he was just passionate about it. And that's one of the things I really liked about Colby as well, is besides having this great classical curriculum, they rooted everything in this lens of history. Looking at everything through the lens of history is just such a beautiful thing to do. Sort of simply stated, we're incarnational people, right? I mean, we're part of the incarnation, and history is simply is simply that, looking at history, looking at everything through history is incarnational. The incarnation is such an important part of our lives as Catholics. And I knew once I went to Christendom, I wanted to study history because I was interested in so many different topics. I was interested in literature and theology and philosophy and political science and all of these different subject matters. And I realized that I could study all of them within that lens of history and sort of delve into them and see them. Um, uh, and that's one of the things I love about Colby is they make the connection with all their courses, especially with literature and theology and history. They're all connected together every year. So we especially see that in the high school years, but even in sort of the middle school years, you can still see that in a simple way. Looking at it through that lens is so important. God became man. God chose to disclose himself, embedded himself in human history in a moment in time. And so we learn everything that he revealed to us about himself through history.
From the beginning of your Kolbe experience, Hope, I remember you and our mom talking about how you appreciated how all the Kolbe courses fit together with across the different subject areas, how they were all connected. And that's like what you're saying, Therese.
Things aren't compartmentalized in Colby, which I really, really appreciate. And I started Colby in 9th grade, as I think I've mentioned before. So at first it was a little much to keep up with. Of whoa, this is showing up in history and literature and theology, and trying to figure out what was going on. But as I got used to it that 9th grade year, I really came to appreciate it.
My students, I love it. I call it those light bulb moments. And we're in class and we're talking about a particular topic and they're like, Mrs. Prudlo, did you know that we just talked about that same thing in theology class today or in literature class? And I'm like, oh, did you? I said, somehow we coordinated all of that. But I mean, it's beautiful, and they are making connections from different aspects, So in theology, they're talking about, the heresies of the early church from the theological standpoint. We're looking at it in history, like when it happened, who was involved, what sort of long-term impact it had on Christendom at that time. In literature, they're looking at how it may have influenced the literature of the time, literature of the day, how people were presenting themselves. It's really neat. It's really neat to see those little moments and those connections, like you were talking about, Hope, where of them putting those pieces together, and that's why I like history. Is that it sits back there in the back and sort of helps them put the pieces together of where everyone fits and such to come to a fuller understanding, which I think is great.
Throughout the history of mankind, we have been through any number of experiences, any number of conflicts and periods of growth and decline. That where we are now comes from those moments, and certain the circumstances may change. They're not exactly the same, but there's very little that hasn't come up before.
That's true. And the students will notice that too. They're like, this is very similar to something that's happening in today's world. And so we try to make those connections, help them make those connections today, that, there's some things that change, but then some things that truly do stay the same. And
I've had an opportunity to see the Colby history curriculum from 2nd grade and up. So it started with, age appropriate stories for the younger students, Bible history, and also stories about the founding fathers and early American history, that kind of thing. And now our younger students are in the Catholic Textbook Project books. And I really, really like those a lot. And a quote I found in the teacher's manual from the American history textbook for 5th grade, From Sea to Shining Sea, about historical figures being flesh and blood. They're people just like we are, and all that entails, and how that can be easy to forget, but also important to remember. Even going back to the ancients, as the students get up into high school, and Hope has talked about that before, and our oldest, who is in high school now, talks about that as well.
They weren't just books out there and story. They're not just fairy tales. They're real. And I think, again, it brings us back. I know I keep saying this, but it brings us back to that, the real connection that we want to have with the people in our past as we're learning about them, that they're not just floating out there. And I think Colby does a really great job with that throughout the curriculum. You were mentioning in the little kids, the K through 5 subjects in there. I mean, it's beautiful. They're able to they're engaging with it, just getting to know the stories about these people. They're reading the simple textbooks, even in so much as picture books for the kids, letting them engage with people in their time. You start with, the stories. I mean, we have, the ancient Greek myths, you have children's Homer on a sort of a more simple level, and Lives of the Saints and such. And then you encourage them to do hands-on activities, visiting your local museums, learning about your local history as well as history far off and your church history. And then that allows them to develop very nicely into, those a little bit more formal education into history, to know a little bit more about names and dates and places and ideas and how they developed and grow and how they change, and how they're used in different ways even today. But no, I think that's it's really important to see all these different subjects.
One of the ideas you just mentioned, I heard you say, and I was going to ask you about this too, is this idea of bringing together both the books that we read, but more experiential learning about history by visiting museums, or in our area, and I would imagine other places, there are old-time one-room schoolhouses where children can go for the day to experience the life of a child 100 years ago or whatever. These kinds of living history opportunities.
That's a really great way, especially for younger kids, to sort of engage with different times and to learn about them a little bit, to go and see those. But when I was growing up, I used to live near Williamsburg, and so we would try to go to Williamsburg and go and see that, and that was always it was fun and special to see all those different things. And it gave a sort of a different context to bring to life in a certain way some of the stories that you're reading about. But I always am a huge fan of encouraging people to explore their local history and backgrounds, and go visit museums and all sorts in their historical societies near them, to museums as well. I mean, I am a huge fan of museums. I grew up near the Smithsonian's in DC, and it seemed like every other week my parents would load us up in the car and take us into the city to go to just explore the different museums. Of course, my favorite was the American History Museum and the National Gallery of Art. My dad he was in the Navy, and he had always loved the Air and Space Museum, so we would always go there, and all those different things. But I think it's really important, and a great thing that has come up more recently, and actually they're expanding this now because of some of our current environment here, is you have great access to virtual museum tours for so many different places as well. And I'm always encouraging my students to go and take some of those virtual tours. And if we have time, we do it ourselves in our classes.
Okay, so sometimes I think, well, let's find a virtual tour on this. There seem to be so many options now. And then I sort of freeze up thinking, I have all these options. Which one do I choose? Or I go to one, and then it's very difficult to navigate the site to get to where I want to be. And then we're all sitting there going, okay, what is this? Like, what are we doing here? So do you have some, are we done yet?
Yes. Well, and that can happen. Technology is still trying to catch up with some of these museums, and they are improving all the time. I know the Met in New York has virtual tours. National Gallery of Art will do virtual tours on certain exhibits. A favorite of mine to go to virtually is the Vatican Museum. Actually has a pretty nice virtual tour that you can walk through all their different rooms. The Louvre also has a pretty nice virtual tour that you can go through and see it. I'll send some of these to you if you want to add them into our link at the bottom of the podcast. But Google Maps actually has some tours as well, for a couple different places. My favorite one is the Catacombs of St. Priscilla in Rome, which is fantastic. And it's actually a Google Maps tour, and you walk through the catacombs on there, and you can see one of the earliest paintings of Our Lady there in the catacombs. We have an online spiritual life oratory at Colby Academy where we meet together for weekly rosaries and Monday morning school prayer. And that is our picture at the head of our when you come into our oratory is that picture from St. Priscilla down there. So that's one of my favorites.
I remember when I was a kid, our mom and I would go to museums, and then since she was learning along with me, we would get there, and with the in-person tours, we'd kind of have well, now what? Especially if we had missed the guided tours or whatever, and we were just kind of left to our own device. Sometimes it was fun to walk around and see what we could find, but we ended up finding a lot of value in doing various scavenger hunts at different museums, because that was a way to have a little bit of structure and a little bit of, oh, this goes to this and then this goes to that and things like that helped us put it into context and know what to be looking for.
Hope, that is an excellent idea. That is, back when my kids were little and I was first homeschooling, and we were very fortunate to get to travel a good bit. And my kids, to keep them from getting bored going to places, is I would try to make scavenger hunts for them to go and see. So I love hearing that you and your mom did that as well. That's fantastic. I think, and that's something I would definitely encourage. Have a purpose, have something you want to go see. Don't just, look it up before you go beforehand and say, oh, I want to go see this one room of art at the museum, and use that as your starting point, and then sometimes that'll lead you to other places that you can go in and explore. Because again, that's what I love about history, is it's all about exploring. You're exploring topics, you're exploring, you may have started, like I'll have a student who'll come in and says, I love learning about World War II and battles. And I said, okay, so, let's pick one that you want to, talk about and delve into. But then that could lead to other questions and sort of guide them to other topics as well. And so they often will end up wanting to talk about something that they weren't even sure they wanted to talk about when they first started.
And find a new area of interest as well that relates or even goes in a new direction. That's neat.
Exactly.
At least for me, in my experience, when I approached the homeschool curriculum, like, okay, we've got this subject and we've got that subject, it was lost to me until a little later on that there are ways to combine the subjects of history and literature, even in the younger grades with Colby, with many of the saint stories and the historical fiction that is on the literature lists for the younger grades as well. So I think that's another way that we've been able to work in a lot of history, is by reading the historical fiction and the saint stories that are included.
Yeah, I think it's so neat, the connections you can make within the curriculum at Colby specifically, and how history can really help tie it all together. And I really appreciated the emphasis that they put on the historical aspect of history as with their curriculum. And I think the addition of those Catholic textbook project books has been a really nice sort of segue between the early years leading into those primary source high school textbooks. So I know you've talked a lot about your high school years at Colby Academy. So what was your favorite subject that you had? And it's okay if it's not history.
It became history and literature. It didn't start out that way. So I had no classical background coming into ninth grade, and so we hit ninth and 10th grade battles and wars, and I just said, what's going on? I don't like this. We tried to balance it out. I did extra reading, like from D'Aulaire's book of Greek myths, to remind me there was more to the Greeks than the Battle of Troy, things like that. And so in my early high school years, I really liked science. I wanted to do something in the medical field, so I took honors biology and things like that. And then to survive chemistry, I needed twice a week tutoring with a friend of my mom's who actually was the high school chemistry teacher in our town. And history and literature, there were fewer battles, but they also were in more context. Like the context had built up without me really even recognizing it as we were going. And so at that point, I kind of shifted and more toward the history and the literature as I really saw the people involved in it. And I may have told the story on the podcast already, but I'm not sure. There was one remark in, I think it was Livy, talking about Julius Caesar and his troops grilling asparagus for dinner. We had grilled asparagus for dinner the night before. And so to 14 or 15-year-old me, I was just like, they are real people. And so then we called them asparagus moments.
I like the asparagus moments. I think that's really appropriate in there. It's much more historical context. I really enjoy that. Yeah, I mean, you want to see them build. You want to see them, sort of engage in sort of that more simple level at the younger age, and so that they come to have a love of it, so that when they get older and they start learning the details, they're like, oh, I remember this. I remember what we were talking about. I remember painting clay pots when I was little with different scenes on it from the ancient Greeks, and now we're talking about these stories, and I always try to connect whatever we're learning in class time, at least within my live classes. So I always try to find some visual to go on my PowerPoint, such as a picture or a vase or a building that is connected directly to what we're discussing, so they can say, wow, that's really there. This is the real place people went and saw and talked about. And I explained to them, like we, at one point in the 11th grade history, we start talking about Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres. And I said, and you can go there. I mean, you're reading about it here in this book, but you can go put your hands on the walls and touch the same place that everyone throughout history has walked through, just setting their hand against the wall and be so connected to them. And the students are like, wow, and they really enjoy that. And
one of our upcoming episodes is with an alumna who went on the Chartres pilgrimage just last year. Keep listening, and I think that one will come out a couple weeks from now.
And there are some great resources that are discussing the restoration that they're doing at Chartres right now. I can send you the link for that as well. The New Liturgical Movement had a link to some of the restoration projects that they're doing. Basically, they're just cleaning it from so many years of pilgrims coming to visit Chartres, and they're just slowly cleaning it. And there was some controversy about whether or not it should be cleaned or what, but it will help to preserve the building as well.
Hearing about traveling on this pilgrimage into all these different places to see where people have been before, like you can actually go there. I've heard you talk before about that's one great way to learn about history is to go and experience it and travel. So I would think that would be especially valuable for the study of ancient history that the high schoolers start.
I think that's great. And the wonderful thing about how Colby segues from those using sort of hands-on and life stories of the saints, going into sort of more of a textbook program. And then one of the things that I loved about Colby as a parent, when I was looking for curriculums for my own children, and I hope you talked about this because you started right in 9th grade, was the connection they have with primary sources in the high school. And the beautiful thing about primary sources, it's sort of similar to what you were saying, Bonnie, about traveling. Traveling, you get to see these places, but sometimes we can't always travel physically to these locations, but we can travel through time and looking at primary sources and looking at what people wrote while things are happening all around them. My students are always amazed by what they learn. They're like, wow, this person actually knew Charlemagne. This person actually was right there talking to St. Augustine, and this is what they wrote. So when we study different people, we read the actual, we talk about St. Monica, we're reading what St. Augustine said about his mother. You can't get more firsthand account than that, and a greater connection. And the importance of engaging with these primary sources. And I think Colby does a great balance of presenting these sources that were there. You're reading them almost in real time as it were, and then trying to give the context to the students to explain what's going on, what's happening, and how they're all connecting together. So we're in ancient Greece. We're talking Herodotus is discussing the various battles, the Persian Wars, and then we're going to go right into Thucydides and discuss, again, those same people are going to crop up again, and we're going to talk about Themistocles and all of his exploits, as it were, and then not too far in the future, we'll be delving into Plutarch, who, of course, is writing a little bit later, but he still he had read those primary sources, and then he compiles more works about these people and really getting to know them in sort of an intimate level, and to really engage with the history. I think it's really important. It can be challenging, absolutely, but I think as they get used to it and start to see how the connections that are being made, they become, they're fascinated by it and they want to read more, even amongst the textbooks. So Colby offers, besides our primary source classes, we also have, in high school, there's that opportunity for some textbook high school courses as well through Colby. But even with those, we try to engage with them with, perhaps a short reading here and there of a primary source to add to that. And that is a nice thing with those Catholic textbooks projects, books in the high school level, is that they will also insert sometimes some short segments from primary sources, because it's so important to look at history with the people who were living it at the time, and to engage with that.
One thing that I experienced from the student side of those primary sources, you mentioned that it can be challenging, and definitely is, and I talked about that a little bit earlier, but then there's like this sense of, wait a second, I'm being brought into this conversation. Like, kids want to be grown up, right? They want to have a seat at the table. They want to be talked to, taken seriously, and things like that. And so I think it's easy from the student side to go, this is what people don't write like this anymore. People don't talk like this anymore. Why am I reading this? But then kind of past that, there's this, oh, wait a second, I'm getting brought into the conversation as the grown-ups are, as adults are. Like, I'm getting the same information that the people who founded our country were studying when they were growing up. Past the initial wariness that I had in ninth grade, there's also this sense of, like, you've been entrusted with something that you're expected to, you're treated like a full participant in society, rather than as a 13-year-old or a 15-year-old or whatever.
That is so important, Hope. I love how you put that, and you're so right. Is, they want to engage, they want to be part of the conversation, and they can be through that. I mean, what is it? There's that great example where we read Pericles' speech in ancient Greek, and then at the same time, I make sure we all listen to and they read the Gettysburg Address, and Lincoln had read that speech. That. And then the kids love to have the debate, who debated better, and who presented it better, and who learned from the past and improved upon it. Our own founding fathers, they read these books, they engaged with them, and so we in turn can engage with others that later on read these same books and have these conversations. And there's I always see a great connection between when I see the students meet up in sort of their Colby connections and such, and that they have that shared background of knowing some of these stories, and they'll bring them up and relate them to what they're doing today. Like you said, the asparagus moments, having those great asparagus moments and engaging with them. They're finding connections not with just the primary sources at that time, but then all the later writers and people who have also engaged with those primary sources through history and up to our present day. And one thing I hope to do is that those things will never be lost, that we can always make that connection with our past, and it will help us in our present, I hope.
This has been a really illuminating conversation for me, just to think about all these connections that can be made that they're not readily apparent to many of us who are not familiar with the classical education approach, or for whom it might be kind of latent, or just kind of haven't thought about these things for a while. So thanks for bringing them to mind.
First of all, I just want to thank you both, Hope and Bonnie, for taking the time and inviting me here today to be part of your Colby cast. This is such a wonderful thing that you are doing here, discussing these topics for all of our families and friends and such. And for those of us as teachers as well, we really appreciate and enjoy listening in. I would just say, enjoy your engagement with history and with all the things that you can study within history. And that, just remember, I think as we said before, God chose to disclose himself to us through history, through that moment in time, through the incarnation. And the incarnation is so important, as my professor in college always said, and it's my all-time favorite quote, truth exists and the incarnation happened. And that is why we study history. That's why we study all things in history. Never to be afraid of what history has to show us, and that we can learn from it, the good, the bad, and the difficult questions. We should never be afraid to look at all these things and to study them, and that when we study the truth, it's apparent what God's plan is for all of us. And we are incarnational people. We live in time. We should never be afraid of talking about it. Like Dr. Carroll always said, truth exists and the incarnation happened. Beautiful sentiment. It's one I make all my students memorize every year.
Point of orientation, right? Like start here, and then all roads lead back to that.
Yeah. Because there can be difficult topics. I mean, people do have difficulties with certain historical events and wanting to engage in them. And it's okay to look at them from our Catholic. It's not only okay, it's important for us to look at the truth of these events and to recognize them and to see when people fail, because we're all human. We're all human. And our connection with other humans throughout time is so important. Even the saints, the saints are human too, right? So the saints were real people. And I think that's one of the things my students always love so much, is that it's a discussion. They're like, wow, the saints were real people. They really had ups and downs, and they're all different. And I think it's beautiful that, God gives us so many great examples for people to emulate through time, and we also have examples of things not to emulate in time.
He brings good out of everything.
Yes. We don't always see it, and that's why history and that was the other thought I thought I might bring up at the end, is that history is ultimately hope. History is ultimately hope. It's hopeful to look at the good, the bad, and the people striving for something more, and especially in our Catholic history, in our history of the Church, and what is it? Catholic Textbook Project says the study of history is the study of the Church. You can't study one without the other, but that. One thing we know through history is it makes us hopeful for the future. You can never be truly pessimistic in current and difficult times when you look to the past and you see what others have struggled with and worked towards. It's ultimately hopeful.
So in Colby 12th grade, and I forget whether it's in history or in theology, they have you read Catechism paragraph 302, which talks about how the world is in a state of journeying toward its ultimate perfection. And that, I think, sums up Colby in one paragraph, of all of the triumphs and all of the foibles and all of the tragedies. They're all still on that path to greater perfection.
St. Augustine, City of God, we're all leading towards the City of God at the end. I mean, we're in tension right now. The city of man is striving, but ultimately the goal is for the city of God to win. And that's what we aim towards. I love that, Hope. That's a great quote. I'm going to have to add that to my reading list for my students this year.
Mary, our Mother, pray for us. St. Maximilian Kolbe, pray for us. Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam.